Imagine discovering a food that could feed millions of people, power the Industrial Revolution, and help change the course of human history. But that same food would later trigger one of the worst disasters in human history.
Before we continue, subscribe and join us as we uncover the incredible stories hidden in history.
When the first Spanish explorers dragged a muddy, misshapen brown lump out of the high Andes in the mid-1500s, they had no idea they were holding the fuel for a future global revolution. To the Incas, it was papa, a gift from the earth that could grow where corn died, surviving the harshest mountain freezes and the thinnest air. It was the bedrock of an empire. But when it crossed the Atlantic and landed on European shores, the reaction wasn't one of gratitude or curiosity. It was pure, unadulterated horror. You have to put yourself in the shoes of a 16th century peasant. Life was a constant struggle against the elements, and your understanding of the world was dictated by tradition, the church, and the soil. Everything you ate came from above the ground: wheat, rye, barley, oats. These were holy crops that reached toward the heavens, swaying in the sunlight. Then, sailors brought back this thing that grew in the dark, silent dirt. In an era where people were deeply superstitious, anything that grew underground was suspicious. It was associated with the dead, with witches, and with the devil himself. The potato was literally chthonic, belonging to the underworld. But the fear wasn't just spiritual. It was scientific for the time. Early botanists looked at the potato's leaves and flowers and realized it belonged to the Solanaceae family, the nightshades. It was a cousin to mandrake, henbane, and the deadly belladonna. Rumors began to spread through the villages of France, Prussia, and England. It causes leprosy, some claimed, citing the tuber's lumpy, skin-like texture. It's a source of the plague, others whispered. In some parts of Europe, the potato was actually banned by law. It was a vegetable non grata. Even the Bible, people noted, made no mention of the potato, which for many was proof enough that it wasn't meant for human consumption. For nearly 2 centuries, the most calorie-dense, easy-to-grow food on the planet was relegated to feeding pigs or serving as a curiosity in ornamental gardens. It sat in the margins of history, a forbidden tuber waiting for a crisis or a clever king to finally break the curse. It was a botanical pariah. People would rather starve during a bad grain harvest than eat the poisonous lumps growing in the dirt. This cultural wall was so thick that it took more than just hunger to break it. It took a fundamental shift in how humanity viewed nature itself. Imagine the irony. Millions of people living on the edge of subsistence, their lives dictated by the fickle success of wheat, while the solution to their hunger was literally beneath their feet. The potato was the ultimate underdog of history, a silent observer to the rise and fall of kings, waiting for its moment to save and eventually haunt the world. By the mid-1700s, Europe was caught in a brutal, exhausting cycle of famine and war. The Little Ice Age had made grain harvests unpredictable, and the population was beginning to outgrow the land's ability to provide. Monarchs across the continent realized they were sitting on a ticking time bomb of social unrest. A hungry population is a revolutionary population. They knew the potato was the answer. It was hardy, it grew in poor soil, and it was easy to hide from marauding armies who would usually burn standing grain fields to starve out an enemy. The problem? The peasants still wouldn't touch it. They viewed it as a peasant's food that wasn't even fit for peasants. This led to 2 of the most brilliant marketing campaigns in human history, led by 2 men who understood human nature better than anyone: Frederick the Great of Prussia and a French pharmacist named Antoine-Augustin Parmentier. Frederick the Great was a man of cold logic. He saw his people starving and his soldiers weak from malnutrition. He issued potato decrees, legally ordering his subjects to plant them. But the Prussian peasants were famously stubborn. They told the king's messengers, "The things have no smell and no taste, and even the dogs won't eat them, so what use are they to us?" Frederick realized that you can't force people to change their culture through law. You have to change their perception through desire. So he tried a different tactic: reverse psychology. Frederick planted a massive field of potatoes on his royal grounds in Berlin and branded them a royal vegetable. fit only for the nobility and the king's table. Then, and this was the stroke of genius, he stationed heavy, armed guards around the field. He gave the guards a very specific secret order. Don't actually guard the field very well. He told them to look sleepy, take long breaks, and look the other way if anyone approached the perimeter. The local peasants, who had previously treated the potato with contempt, watched this precious royal crop being guarded day and night, and their curiosity was piqued. They thought, if the king is protecting it this much, it must be incredibly valuable. It must be a treasure. Under the cover of night, the villagers began stealing the potatoes from the royal gardens to plant in their own secret patches. Frederick got exactly what he wanted by pretending he didn't want them to have it. He hacked the human brain's desire for the forbidden. Meanwhile, in France, Antoine-Augustin Parmentier was pulling a similar stunt. Having survived on potatoes as a prisoner of war in Prussia, he knew they were lifesavers. But the French were even more resistant than the Prussians. The potato was actually illegal to grow for human consumption in France until 1772 because people believed it caused leprosy. To win over the French elite, Parmentier hosted lavish dinners where every single course, from the soup to the dessert, was made of potatoes. He even invited Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin to these potato galas. He famously gave a bouquet of potato flowers to King Louis XVI, who pinned them to his lapel, while Marie Antoinette wore them in her hair as a fashion statement. Suddenly, the devil's root was the height of fashion. If the king and queen endorsed it, it couldn't be evil. The forbidden tuber had become the royal root, and the cultural barriers were finally smashed. The potato began its march across Europe, transforming from a feared weed into the engine of a new era. With the royal seal of approval and the fear of the devil's root fading into the background of history, the potato didn't just become a side dish. It became the primary fuel for the modern world. If you look at a graph of the world's population, there is a massive, nearly vertical spike that begins in the late 1700s. While historians often credit the steam engine, the cotton gin, or medical advances for this explosion of humanity, many modern scholars argue that the real hero, or perhaps the silent accomplice, was the humble tuber. The potato was a biological miracle for a growing, hungry Europe. To understand the scale of this impact, you have to look at the math of survival. In the pre-industrial world, land was the ultimate currency. If you grew wheat or rye, you needed vast amounts of acreage to feed a single family, and the soil would often be exhausted after just a few seasons. But the potato changed the equation entirely. You could grow 3 to 4 times as many calories on a single acre of land with potatoes than you could with any grain. Furthermore, the potato was packed with more than just energy. It was a superfood before the term existed. It contained vitamin C, which virtually eliminated scurvy in Northern Europe, as well as potassium and essential amino acids. For the first time in human history, the Malthusian trap, the grim theory that a population would always eventually outgrow its food supply and be corrected by famine, was broken. This abundance of easy calories did something revolutionary. It allowed people to leave the farm. Because a small patch of land could now feed a large family, there was a surplus of human life. Young men and women who would have previously spent their lives tethered to a wheat field flocked to the cities. They became the factory workers, the coal miners, the engineers, and the sailors of the Industrial Revolution. In a very literal sense, the smoke-belching cities of the 1800s and the rise of global empires were built on the back of the potato. It provided the cheap, dense energy required for the grueling 14-hour shifts of the Victorian era. However, this success was a double-edged sword. As nations became dependent on this one miracle crop, they began to abandon the diverse agricultural traditions that had sustained them for centuries. In Ireland, this dependency reached a terrifying extreme. Because of a complex and oppressive system of land tenancy, Irish peasants were often restricted to tiny plots of land, while the best soil was used by landlords to grow grain for export. To survive on these tiny scraps of dirt, the Irish people turned almost exclusively to a single variety of potato, the lumper. The lumper was a high-yield, hardy potato, but it was a genetic clone. Across the entire island, millions upon millions of plants were genetically identical. This created a massive, beautiful, green landscape of productivity, but it was also a biological house of cards. The world had become so efficient at feeding itself with one single plant that it had forgotten the most basic rule of nature. Diversity is the only true defense. While Europe's population doubled and empires expanded their reach across the globe, a silent, microscopic threat was brewing in the shadows. The stage was now set for the most haunting chapter in the lore of the potato, a botanical disaster that would prove that the engine of empire was far more fragile than anyone dared to imagine. In the summer of 1845, the miracle finally broke. A strange, heavy, and unusually warm fog rolled across the fields of northern Europe, carrying with it a microscopic passenger that would do more damage to the world's map than any invading army or political revolution. It was Phytophthora infestans, the late blight. To the farmers of the time who had no knowledge of germ theory, it looked like a literal curse from God. One day, the potato plants looked lush, vibrant, and green. The next, the leaves were covered in black, oily spots and the stems were collapsing. When the farmers desperately dug into the earth, hoping to salvage their winter food supply, they found only a mushy, foul-smelling black liquid. While the blight struck crops across Europe, from Prussia to the Low Countries, nowhere was the devastation as absolute or as tragic as in Ireland. Because the Irish population had become so utterly dependent on the lumper variety, there was no plan B. There were no other crops to turn to, and no savings to buy imported food. This wasn't just a bad harvest. It was a total and sudden collapse of the entire life support system for millions of people. Within weeks, the sweet smell of the Irish countryside was replaced by the overwhelming, sickly stench of millions of tons of rotting vegetation. But the lore of the Great Hunger isn't just a story of a fungus. It is a story of profound human and political failure. At the very height of the famine, while skeletal families were dying in their cottages or along the roadsides, Ireland was actually exporting massive amounts of food. Ships laden with grain, butter, and livestock were leaving Irish ports bound for England and beyond, often under armed guard to prevent the starving population from seizing the food they had grown. The prevailing political philosophy of the time, laissez-faire capitalism, suggested that the government should not interfere with the market, even as 1 million people perished from hunger and disease. The aftermath was world-altering. Over 1 million people died in Ireland, their bodies often buried in mass graves without names. But another 2 million people did something that changed the course of history forever. They fled. They piled onto coffin ships, vessels so overcrowded and disease-ridden that many died before ever seeing land, and crossed the Atlantic. This massive wave of migration didn't just fill the ports of New York, Boston, and Quebec. It reshaped the political, religious, and cultural landscape of the Western world. The forbidden tuber had triggered a diaspora that would eventually lead to the rise of Irish-American political power and the permanent shifting of global demographics. Today, we walk through a grocery store and see the potato as a simple, cheap, and perhaps even boring side dish. But its history is a haunting reminder of the delicate balance between human ingenuity and natural disaster. It took us from the brink of ancient starvation to the heights of the industrial age, only to show us how quickly a civilization can fall when it loses its connection to the diversity of the earth. The story of the potato is the ultimate brew lore, a tale of fear, trickery, triumph, and tragedy that is still written in the DNA of millions of people around the world today. It is the plant that saved the world, only to show us how easily the world could be broken.